As John Quincy Adams predicted, the slavery conflict was laid to rest, at least for a time. During the 1820s, Americans paid more attention to the juicy election scandals than they did to the plight of slaves. But beneath that silence, a powerful force was building that would push the conflict out into the open again, a great revival of religious faith and fervor. Traveling ministers organized huge outdoor camp meetings where they preached a message of comfort and hope. God would grant salvation to anyone who turned away from their sins and pledged their lives to the Lord's work, they said. And the Lord's work for some was the abolition of slavery, emancipating or freeing all slaves at once. The Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier spoke for many abolitionists when he wrote,
"We say to slaveholders, repent now, today, immediately. Such is our doctrine of immediate emancipation, a doctrine founded on God's eternal truth, plain, simple, and perfect."
Abolitionists flooded the nation's capital with anti-slavery petitions, only to be told that Congress had no power to interfere with slavery in the states. What about the District of Columbia, they persisted. Surely Congress has the power to ban slavery in the nation's capital. Rather than face that question, Congress voted in 1836 to table all anti-slavery petitions without so much as reading them. Outraged abolitionists called this decision the gag rule. While the gag rule choked off all debate on slavery in Congress, it did not silence the abolitionists. They continued to attack slavery in books, newspapers, and at public meetings. The pictures you are looking at here appeared in an abolitionist newspaper. In one frame, you see a mother being sold from her child. In another, field workers are being lashed with a whip. In yet another, a runaway slave is being attacked by dogs. These are not pleasant images to look at, nor were they intended to be. The abolitionists saw themselves crusaders fighting to save the soul of a nation. And in this crusade, their main weapon was the ugly reality of slavery. As William Lloyd Garrison announced in the first issue of his abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator,
"I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard."
White Southerners took little notice of the abolitionists when they first began to attack slavery. They had learned long ago not to get upset by the ranting of a few fanatics. Then something happened to change their minds. On August 13th, 1831, the morning sun shone a peculiar shade of greenish blue in Virginia. That afternoon, a dark spot moved ominously across the sun's face. To a slave named Nat Turner, these strange solar events were signs from God, signs telling him that
"I should arise and prepare myself, and slay my enemies with their own weapons."
Turner and 6 fellow slaves armed themselves with axes and set out to kill every white person they could find. By the time their reign of terror ended 2 days later, some 60 white men, women, and children had been hacked to death. This picture shows these events in Virginia from a white point of view. At the top, you can see some of the rebel slaves' victims pleading for mercy or defending their loved ones. At the bottom, you see the troops who quickly hunted down the rebels. Left out of this picture completely are the hundreds of innocent slaves who were massacred by revenge-crazed whites in the week following the slave rebellion. Nat Turner's rebellion stunned white Southerners. They had long defended slavery by telling themselves that Africans were a simple, childlike people, content to live as slaves. But Turner and his rebels were clearly not content, nor were they playing children's games. By his actions, Turner had forced Southern whites to face their deepest fear, the fear that if given the chance, most slaves would turn on their masters. As one Virginian said,
"A Nat Turner might be in any family."
In response to this fear, Southern states passed strict new laws outlawing slave meetings. Slave patrols were stepped up, and any slave caught away from home without a pass was whipped at once. Many states also tried to keep abolitionist writings from reaching slaves. Mississippi even offered a reward of $5,000 for the arrest and conviction of any person who shall utter, publish, or circulate abolitionist ideas. Nat Turner's rebellion was the last large-scale slave uprising. But individual slaves continued to rebel by running away to freedom. The risks involved were enormous. Most slaves knew little about the world beyond their plantation, and they had no maps or compass to guide them to free territory. Once missed, they would be pursued by slave hunters and their packs of braying bloodhounds. If caught, they would be subject to terrible punishments, including the chopping off of a foot. Despite such risks, about 1,000 slaves escaped to the north each year. Some of them walked to freedom, traveling at night when they could follow the North Star. Some went by boat or train, using forged identity cards and clever disguises. A few slaves even had themselves shipped north in large wooden boxes. As they made their way northward, runaways were often helped by other slaves, friendly Indians, free blacks, and sympathetic whites. The most famous of these helpers was a fugitive slave named Harriet Tubman. After escaping from slavery herself, Harriet Tubman returned to the South again and again to lead more than 300 slaves to freedom. Blacks called her Moses. Slaveholders called her as a menace. To slaveholders, people like Harriet Tubman were no better than bank robbers. A good slave was a valuable piece of property, and every time one escaped, it was like seeing 5 acres of land vanish into thin air. Slaveholders demanded that Congress do something to stop this loss of property. Meanwhile, they offered a reward of $40,000 for the capture of Tubman, dead or alive. Once out of the South, runaways were still not safe. If caught by slave hunters, they could be shipped home to their masters. Full freedom lay still further north, in Canada. Many slaves were helped on this part of their journey by the Underground Railroad. This railroad without rails was a loose organization of free blacks and anti-slavery whites who opened their homes and hearts to fugitive slaves. Here you see a group of weary runaways arriving at a station, or a safe house, on their way north. Runaway James Pennington later wrote about his arrival at the home of W.W., a station master of the Underground Railroad.
My condition was as wretched as that of any human being can possibly be. I had but 4 pieces of clothing about my person. I was a starving fugitive without home or friends, a reward offered for my person in the public papers, pursued by cruel manhunters, and no claim upon him to whose door I went. Had he turned me away, I must have perished. Nay, he took me in, and gave me of his food, and shared with me his own garments. Such treatment I have never before received at the hands of any white man.
For years, politicians were able to keep the slavery issue out of Congress, but by 1848, this was no longer possible. The gag rule was finally repealed that year, and once again petitions demanding the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C. poured into Congress. Slaveholders, meanwhile, were pushing hard for the passage of a fugitive slave law to help them recapture their runaway property. In 1848, the United States also ended its war with Mexico and took possession of California, New Mexico, and Utah Territory. As a result, Congress again faced the issue of whether or not to allow slavery to expand into new territory. And as it had in the past, this issue aroused furious passions. To understand why, try looking at this map of the United States in 1848 through a Southern politician's eyes. A quick count tells you that the number of free and slave states is balanced at 15 each. But what about the future? All of Louisiana Territory north of the Missouri Compromise line is closed to slavery. So is Oregon Territory. In time, free states will be formed in these regions. If slavery is also banned from the territory won from Mexico, where will new slave states come from to balance these new free states? While Congress was debating this question, California applied for admission to the Union as a free state. Northerners welcomed California with open arms. Southerners, however, rejected California's request. Behind their rejection was the fear that once the equal balance between slave and free states was upset, the South would become, as one person put it,
a fixed, dreary, hopeless minority.
Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky trudged through a Washington snowstorm to pay an unexpected call on his old rival, Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. Clay had come up with a compromise to settle the issues dividing the country. But to get his plan through Congress, Clay knew he would need Webster's support. Clay's compromise began with the admission of California as a free state. This, Webster agreed, should please the North. New Mexico and Utah would be organized as territories open to slavery. This, Clay knew, would please the South. The slave trade, but not slavery, would be abolished in Washington, D.C. This limited ban, Clay hoped, would win the support of abolitionists without threatening slaveholders. Clay's plan also included a strong fugitive slave law, something long sought by slaveholders. Believing that Clay's compromise offered the best chance for ending the slavery controversy, Webster agreed to help push it through Congress. This was easier said than done. Congress debated Clay's proposals for 9 frustrating months. As tempers frayed, hotheads began to threaten secession. If their state didn't get what it wanted, they said, it would secede or peacefully leave the Union. To this, Daniel Webster replied,
Secession. Peaceable secession. Your eyes and mine are never destined to see that miracle. I see it as plainly as I see the sun in heaven. I see that secession must produce such a war as I will not describe.
War? That was something few people were willing to face, at least not yet. In September of 1850, Congress finally adopted Clay's plan. A thoughtful New Yorker named Philip Hone hailed the Compromise of 1850 as a victory over
disunion, fanaticism, violence. The lovers of peace, the friends of the Union, good men, conservatives, have sacrificed sectional prejudices for the Union and peace. But although all good men rejoice that the affair is settled, none are satisfied.